Welcome everybody to the final seminar of Childhood and Society Special Interest Group on Childhood of the Anthropocene, for this academic year anyhow. So today's seminar focuses on ecopedagogies, and we are very happy to have with us Dr. Nick Fryer. The title of Nick's seminar is What's Theatre Got to Do with It? Performance, Everyday Life, and Futures. So I'd like to briefly introduce Nick. So Nick's currently program leader for the foundation degree in learning and teaching at Middlesex. He also teaches on the BA top-up in learning and teaching and the PG certificate in higher education. He has taught in a range of educational settings, including working in drama departments in university for 15 years and secondary schools for 13 years, where he led one of the largest drama cohorts in the UK. Nick has won various awards for his teaching and is senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy. He founded Small Change Theatre, whose production Long Wave, Red Velvet, and Making the Difference, amongst others, toured nationally to a range of venues, including Battersea Arts Centre, Latitude Festival, and Birmingham Repertory Theatre. Nick also has group work practitioner status with the Institute of Group Analysis, with whom he has completed a diploma in group work. So before handing over to Nick, I like to remind you to check that you have muted your audio. The seminar will be recorded and will be available on our SARS website. There will be time at the end for questions, and you can, in the meantime, raise them on the chat. Thank you, and I will now hand over to Nick.
Thank you. Okay, so maybe I just begin by explaining that last week I travelled to Poland and gave a paper as part of the Futures project, which Middlesex has been involved with for the last, I think, 3 or 4 years. And Katerina and Katie, who are in this meeting, and possibly Pedro, colleagues from across the university, may be joining us later. It's part of this conference was part of that project, which I was invited to join in its last stages. And I've actually slightly titled the talk differently because the talk that I gave was actually aimed at high school students, and I will be giving you a little bit of that talk, but I also wanted to not only treat you like high school students, but to also give you a little bit of an overview of the project. So I'm going to start with an overview of the project, then I'm going to share the talk I gave with you, and then offer some of the sorts of questions that working with future studies in this project has raised for me around education. And then hopefully there might be some interesting conversation that comes from that as well. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. Everybody see my screen? Cool. Okay, so yes, I'm actually going to just zoom out a little from the specifics of the talk, which is the title of that was presented, to talk more generally about performance, future studies, and education. So to firstly talk a little bit about the project, and Katerina, if I miss anything out, please feel free to add in, correct me. But it's been a collaboration with several institutions. So we have 2 universities in Białystok in Poland, Hellas Foundation for Research and Technology in Greece, Hansa University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands, and project overseers ValueDeo from Italy. So it's been a real international project. And I think there's been some really interesting things that I've picked up in my latter work from the project about some of the different emphases between some of these different institutions. And I'll kind of talk a little bit about that in a second. But the overall intention of the project was to develop innovative, future-oriented processes, tools and methods that will foster personal and professional development among EU students, early stage researchers and high school students. So this idea of future oriented, I guess, is at the center of this. And one of the things that it's been framed around is around employability. And I think one of the interesting tensions that has come up is around how much that kind of limits the focus of the project and how much actually it provides very practical underpinning, and then thinking more broadly around futures oriented processes kind of allows perhaps for a more speculative approach. Hello, Jane.
Hi, Nick. Sorry to interrupt. I just wondered if you wanted to put it in presenter mode, because we can see your notes.
Oh, is it not?
Timings, yeah.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for letting me know. Better? Right. Sorry about that. Okay. So there were 3 intellectual outputs. Firstly, and I think roughly this corresponds to a year per intellectual output. The first thing was to design principles for a future-oriented training program. And then the last 2 years have been developing a toolbox and training manual, firstly for university students and early stage researchers. And then this year, high school students. And the conference that I went to with Katie in Poland was particularly focused around high school students and trialing some of the workshops that have been developed with them. And these cohered around 3 modules. So anticipation for the future, which was written by the 2 Polish institutions. And I guess this is very much focused around anticipation as in forecasting what's likely to happen, that comes from a sort of business context, I guess, or a sort of thinking about what's likely to happen. How can we predict the future better? How can we plan for it? So it's quite a pragmatic kind of approach to that. The anticipation for emergence module was written by the Greek and Dutch partners, and their context is much more speculative and much more perhaps focused around what's possible, what might be, how do we think outside the box in terms of the future, what might emerge. And then Performance for Futures was written by the Middlesex team and very much focused around the relationship of drama and theatre and performance in relation to the future. What I found quite interesting, and I'm not sure if this was deliberate or accidental, but doing some research around futures studies, that this sort of maps onto some writing by Eleonora Massini, who's a key thinker in future studies. And she said that it involves the possibility of looking into the future at various levels in order to better understand the changing interrelations between man, society, and the environment. And she talks about 3 levels of looking into the future, which reflect 3 different philosophical approaches. The first being about the need to face rapid change and know where the world is going. So to some extent, I think we could sort of map this onto the idea of anticipation for the future, consisting of the data of the past and present towards what's possible and but particularly focusing perhaps on what's probable. The second approach is linked to utopias and desirable societies. In terms of future studies, it's built on the basis of something we wish to happen, more of a speculative approach, and perhaps to some extent linking to the second module, anticipation for emergence, coming more from the Greek-Dutch module. And then the third approach, she says, is a synthesis of the first and second, the level on which people think about the future in terms of projects. And here I think she says this is a synthesis of the first and second, because we're thinking about what's possible, we're thinking about utopias and where we want to go, but at the same time, as you can see here, taking into account empirical data on trends in the past and conditions in the present. And she talks about the value of projects, and to some extent, perhaps this is a bit tendentious, but I think the Middlesex modules based in the experience of being in your body as a student who's actually acting and actually embodying things can be seen as a sort of project where you're taking these things on in practice rather than just abstract conceptualization. And this idea of the projects I'm particularly interested in. And Gidley says about this idea of project building through projects, people can create a futures-oriented project guided by their utopian visions, but taking into account the conditions of the present and past trends. So there's this sort of looking at the future from both a grounded perspective of the present, but also in terms of a visionary possibility of the future. And I guess I would contend that perhaps generally, particularly in the pragmatics of education in the UK, we're often kind of guided towards thinking in terms of what's practical, what's likely to happen, rather than thinking in a visionary way. But certainly this, even if it takes into account both, bringing in this idea of the vision of the future, I think is key. And this idea here that Massini aspires to transform the present by a vision of the future, that the future almost starts things. And Luce Danhoff, somebody who's involved in the project and is the UNESCO chair in futures literacy, gave this quote, which I start my talk to the students with: "It's not what you do today that shapes your future, it's how you look at the future that shapes your present." So I guess this idea that we start with what we want the future to be, or what we think the future might be, and then think about how that might influence us. So this idea of futures literacy, then, to think about this role that Luce has, the skill that allows people to better understand the role of the future and what they see and do. I guess one of the ideas of thinking about futures is that the future is always there in our thinking. It's just that our future, what we think the future is going to be, it tends to be based on our past and based on what we've experienced before. But being futures literate empowers the imagination. And I guess here there is a link to employability, which was identified in the project, I think. This idea that we need to be able to create people who are flexible, particularly in terms of the fast-changing world of the 21st century. And in terms of the conference that we went to in Poland, that was very much oriented around employability in terms of how it was promoted. And I guess that links to the idea that we are in a very fast-changing world, in a world of crisis, with all of these sorts of things that are going on, leading the Collins Dictionary in 2022 to say we were in a state of perma-crisis, and that this was the Collins Dictionary Word of the Year 2022. So we need to really be able to think beyond what's predictable, because we can't rely on what's predictable in terms of what's actually likely to happen. So in terms of drama, theatre and performance then, why futures? Why would we be thinking about futures? Firstly, directing, that the director has to have a vision of what the end product is likely to be before she or he or they start to plan their project. They actually need to be able to visualize it. They need to have conversations, often with a marketing team and set designers before they've even started rehearsals. If they're creating a performance without script, they'll be exploring collectively possible futures. Improvisation, often in drama and theatre, we're actually improvising in the moment, seeing what happens in the present, but also thinking about how this might create a possibility that could be tried out in the future. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this idea of theatre of the oppressed later in the talk, because it was part of the conversation that I had with the students in Poland. But it's a particular technique developed by Augusto Boal, where audience would be able to stop the action and suggest possible ways that things should be done differently. So it's almost a way to model the future. And this might be seen as an example of applied theatre practice, where the idea is that theatre is not just entertainment, but is actually something that might lead to social and political change. But all of these, and I guess one of the things that I think we're particularly talking about last week, is the idea that you feel this in your body, and certainly Katie talked about this a lot in her workshop as well. We're talking about participatory and embodied methodologies. And there's something about experiencing these things physically rather than just conceptually that I think is important, and perhaps we can talk about that in the discussion. I'd be interested to know if that feels like it's something that could apply to other people's contexts as well. Okay. So this was the talk title that I gave last week. I deleted body language in the labour market and wanted to broaden it out into performance, futures, and everyday life. I should just say at this point, because I don't want to forget to say it, that I'd like to credit Pedro. I'm not sure if Pedro's joined us, but Pedro from Theatre Arts, who basically wrote most of those first bits of the slides. But yeah, so I'm going to move now into hopefully trying to dovetail between talking to you as you, but also kind of I'm going to go back slightly into the mode of sharing the talk that I gave to the students, obviously in English. I mean, one of the things we were absolutely astounded by was that we have these students listening in Poland to a whole load of talks given in English in their second language that they just sat and listened to for an hour and a half before doing workshops. And I think that in itself was quite inspiring for us and sort of amazing to sort of think about what is possible from young people. Okay. So I'm going to now go into this talk, and I began with thinking about this quotation from Luce. But it's not what you do today that shapes your future, it's how you look at the future that shapes your present. And I was talking to the students about the fact that we often think that the choices that we make now have consequences for the future. And of course, that's true. But also in future studies, we might start to think about it slightly differently and actually moving from what's likely to happen to actually thinking what's impossible. Thinking beyond just the likely to something much more broad, and that this can enable us to not be limited by our current thinking and to expand possibilities for ourselves. Now, I've already talked about how theatre and performance can be related to the future, but I contended at this point, and this is where I'll perhaps move into the talk that I gave, thinking about how we often talk about theatre and performance in relation to the present. Here's an example of a quotation from a very often cited text in theatre and performance studies, Erving Goffman's The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, where he talks about how performance comes into play in our everyday existence, talking about how a performance may be defined as all the activity of a given participant on a given occasion, which serves to influence in any way any of the other participants. So Goffman's suggesting here that we're always performing, always presenting a version of ourselves. And we do this bearing in mind the audience that our performance is designed for. Here I try to appeal to what I imagine many students would relate to in terms of thinking media and the bits they choose to delete. Also thinking about how we might even perform a version of ourselves to ourselves. Think of trying to put a smile on your face to get through a difficult situation. Think about telling yourself that you deserve a duvet day because you're feeling a bit low. These are performances that are individual, but also performances based on our own needs and desires, but they're also got a social context and are connected to the world. As Richard Schechner puts it, social behaviour is never free and unbound. The lived details of how one adheres to or departs from the expected behaviours constitute the performances of social life. So our everyday performances don't just come from us, they're influenced by the world around us. And to bring in this applicability of this to the job context, I asked students to think about the sorts of clothes they might wear for a job interview, and that this is a type of performance. We learn the sorts of body language we should demonstrate. Perhaps we learn what is expected of us is different for men and for women. Perhaps we should shake hands when we enter the room and give strong eye contact. Perhaps, depending on the role, we should be bright and bubbly or calm and serious. And as well as body language, we learn the sorts of things we might need to say. And if we do these things as expected, perhaps the thinking might be, we will get the job. If we don't fulfill what's expected of us, we probably won't. I'm making a link between some of this and the conventional idea of acting. As Hamlet puts it, when giving advice to the players, the aim is to hold the mirror up to nature. An audience will look at somebody pretending to be somebody else on stage, and if they find it believable, then it will be considered a successful performance. by saying, I really believed you, they engage with the famous theatrical idea of the suspension of disbelief. We know it's not real, but we suspend our disbelief during the duration of the performance. Thinking about this in relation to the idea of a job interview, we might say we've managed to convince the interviewer that we are the right sort of person for a job, that we've achieved a kind of conjuring trick in the present. The theatre practitioner Bertolt Brecht, refers to this as a hypnosis, where the actors put themselves and the audience into a trance that occurs in the shared space and time of the present. So why theatre in relation to futures then? Middlesex's interest, I'm going to say, if I say our, please forgive me, because I used the hour last week when I was talking as part of this project, even though I didn't write these modules. Middlesex's interest in this project was not about making theatre where you have to act accurately and be convincing. It's not only about convincing the people that are interviewing you that you can do the job that they expect you to do. It's also about getting them to believe that you are somebody who can move beyond those expectations, who can offer a vision of something beyond what is currently known. Brecht's description here, and of the idea of a hypnosis, is a critical term. He says that in such theatre, it ends up with nobody learning anything, with the audience ceasing to see anything at all, just the mirror image. Instead, he proposes that theatre, and perhaps we can relate this to education, can be a kind of science. He talks about using theatre to discuss and debate and develop learning. In the Brechtian theatre, the actor might come out of character and talk to the audience. According to Richard Schechner again, the Brechtian performer alternates between being in character and stepping out of character to comment on the actions, pointing out what one can learn from the situation. Talking to the audience, being with the audience, and perhaps crucially, getting them to think. We can learn from acting. It can facilitate conversation and an awareness of different perspectives. But going back to this idea of embodiment, I think the fact that you feel it in your body is really crucial. You've got a range of tools that you can draw on in your everyday life. And as you start to embody these, you expand those opportunities. And again, this is something that I was trying to talk about to students in terms of something that was very applicable to a real life context. But I hope that as I go through this talk, you'll hear that I'm also suggesting it has wider ramifications as well. So much for the conceptual stuff. Let's think about how this was put into practice in the workshops. So here's some pictures here of some of the early training modules. There's Pedro from Theatre Arts there in blurry outline. So the Futures Training Manual says, in the theatre we play. Accordingly, all three acts are designed to be enjoyed and to give students different tools to playfully explore their imagined futures. As TJ Bacon from Theatre Arts, who wrote in a post on the Futures website, in the workshop of the theatre practitioner, we'll often play through games to explore unfamiliar scenarios so that we may be better prepared as performers. Our lived experience here is real, but held in a context of safety, where participants may relish in the opportunity to fail. So in the safety of the theatre workshop, people can step out of their comfort zone, but knowing that it's safe to do so. And obviously, speaking to many people here who are involved in education, you'll be aware of the relevance of play to learning. I hardly need to go through that, but I guess as we get older, we can lose our capacity for playfulness. Finding that childish playfulness as adults enables us to move beyond what's expected of us into exploring possible and impossible futures. And playfulness doesn't mean not serious. As any football fan will tell you, games can be taken seriously and be something you're passionate about. And the game is real. To some extent, there is something being played out which is unpredictable. We might even say that playing a game creates a new future, something that wasn't planned. And this idea of not knowing, throughout the Middlesex modules, you'll find this phrase written, the future doesn't exist yet, trying to encourage students to think about what the future could be, not what they expect it to be. And at this point, I tried to talk to the students about that idea of failure as well, and talked about the fact that they could do Katie's workshop even if they had no experience of acting or performance, using this as a little trailer, if you will, because I think that it's quite scary, this idea of embodiment, but also to recognize that it's something which, when it's experienced physically, can really offer students a way of knowing things that is not possible just through conceptual understanding. So this play is important play, which enables people to explore possibilities, which is what's needed in the unpredictable and unknown 21st century. So far, I hope you can see that I've been talking very much from the perspective of this sort of job approach, thinking about how students could use some of these ideas to become beyond what they currently are. But I also wanted to talk about social element of this as well. When you play, you'll not have the same idea about how you play as somebody else. In fact, if everybody played the game in the same way, it would get quite boring. Instead, you get lots of people playing in different ways. This idea of trying different ways that a scene might play out, to go back to our job interview situation, think about different ways of entering a room or of speaking to people, means that we don't get stuck in one way of being, doing, thinking, talking. We become social beings who interact and discuss how we might best do that and what might feel right for us as opposed to somebody else. Theatre fits then with Joe Kelleher's idea of theatre as an ideal place or an ideal social organisation that is unlikely to be found yet in this or any other given space, a space of the future, perhaps. And because it's competing ideas of the future, you'll notice that I talk about futures, plural studies. We can't know the future, after all, it doesn't exist yet. So we're liberated from trying to predict the future. And Jennifer M. Gidley says, once we know there's not one predictable future, we're freer to imagine alternative futures and to work towards creating the futures we prefer, both for ourselves and humanity. So I'm going to move now to just talk a little bit more about Augusto Boal, who I mentioned earlier, a Brazilian theatre practitioner who we look at in one of the workshops. Boal's theatre of the oppressed in the late 20th century sought to empower those less fortunate by exploring alternatives to their current life. So Boal actually talks about the idea of an active spectator, and he actually uses the term spectactor, the idea of you being an active spectator, somebody who's participating. In his forum theatre, the spectator can stop the action if they don't like what's happening. They can then suggest that the actors try things in a different way. These alternative scenes can be played out by the actors and give participants a range of possibilities for the future. And it's this debate around this that's important. Boal said, I believe it's more important to achieve a good debate than a good solution. This social interaction provides an awareness of the contingency of the future. It's not about just developing, it is about, developing participants' creativity and adaptability, thinking beyond the mirror. Boal also said theatre is a form of knowledge. It should and can also be a means of transforming society. Theatre can help us build our future rather than just waiting for it. And that's what Middlesex has been trying to do through these workshops and this project. As Andreas Schleicher, director of the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development Directorate for Education and Skills, said, to prepare our education systems for what may come, we have to consider not only the changes that appear most probable, but also the ones we are not expecting. And to come back to that quotation at the beginning, it's how you look at the future that shapes your present. And that was how I ended my talk. And then students were given a range of different workshops they could participate in. So you can see the first 3 columns here linked to those 3 workshops. So just got that Zoom thing at the top. Anticipation for emergence, performance for futures, and anticipation for the future. And then some more pragmatic opportunities, searching for a first job and effective communication, again, under the frame of that employability focus of the conference. I think it's quite interesting that there's these more I guess, conceptual and abstract workshops alongside very pragmatic workshops, and perhaps that's a sort of interesting tension that's going on here. And in terms of the Middlesex workshop, Katie firstly encouraged students to think about status as a shifting concept that meant they would perform statuses and think about how they might shift their status, raise their status or lower their status in relation to somebody else. And what was a really interesting conversation, I thought, was hearing students talk about whether they were more comfortable with raising their status or lowering their status, and starting to recognize those habits that started to form, but they could then start to alter and shift, and how uncomfortable some of them felt, say, about trying to gain status, feeling like they were perhaps being too dominating, or lowering their status, they feel vulnerable, but actually in the playful space of a studio, drama studio, being able to explore that. So that's very much about themselves. And then what I think is very interesting is that Katie then invited them to choose an object which they felt symbolized the future in the room. And this involved all sorts of things. We're in a library, so that involved people choosing a bookend, a plant that was lying on the side, but also like a plastic bottle cap. And students were talking about why they chose those objects, what that represented to them about the future. And I think it was really important to hear them talk about why they chose these objects, sort of investing them with not just literal, but symbolic meaning. And then they improvised in groups their physical relationship to the object. So did they care and nurture for the plant? Did they need to protect it? Did they need to explore different possibilities? The bookend became this way of supporting books and seeing what was possible and needing to ensure things didn't fall over. And they were talking about all of this in a really rich, metaphorical way that really encouraged them to explain and put into practice some of this stuff that we've been talking about in the lectures. And although I think we were nervous that they may not have taken much in an hour and a half of listening to people talk in a second language, it was evident that it had really made an impact. So that's the workshop that we did. And I think it was really brilliantly run by Katie, but it was also just a really effective way of kind of fitting with the ideas of the project as a whole. And then I was sort of interested in looking into the relationship between future studies and education. And I came across this this discussion in Gidley's book about the future, talking about the Declaration of Human Rights of everyone having a right to education. And just starting to problematize that a little bit in terms of future studies, thinking that there are some issues around this. Firstly, the idea that actually whose education, that we may be importing a Western, bringing education to countries that haven't traditionally had mass education. Whose education system is that? And is it really appropriate for that country, or is there a danger of colonialism here? Secondly, a kind of question as to whether or not attendance is necessarily always the most important thing. Does attendance necessarily mean effective learning, or learning that will facilitate effective living? Can education be destructive? And will the imported education model meet the needs of the future? And I thought it was really interesting to read this, that John Coonrod suggested that there is a move from the Millennium Development Goal 2015 of access for all towards what that education is. And I just thought that was a very interesting thing in terms of sustainability, and thinking about, again, I guess, thinking about ecosystems and the context of eco-pedagogies of this series. Thinking about something that's sustainable means that we need to not just think about it for its own sake, but something which will actually make a positive impact. And then I was thinking about Boal's Theatre of the Oppressed, and I'm sure many people here will be familiar with Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. Obviously, there is a link here, both Brazilian practitioners who were passionate about trying to make theatre and make education which would help those less fortunate and those perhaps who had not traditionally had access to theatre or to education, aiming to use education and theatre to help them find a voice. I guess in relation to futures, we might say they're ensuring the present isn't limited by the present, but enabling the participants to recognise other possible futures. However, it also reminded me of a critique that I engaged with in my PhD research, that there is a danger perhaps in some of these approaches that they presume a problem in the present, inequality, which needs to be erased in the future. And Roncière critiques this type of approach by saying it reproduces an approach that confirms present inequality in the name of an equality to come. So I started thinking about this in relation to futures. In other words, that we're thinking very much about the hopeful future rather than thinking about actually where do we want to be, where do we think we could be, and actually are starting right now, letting that influence our present, rather than saying there's a problem that needs to be resolved, starting with the vision of where we might be. And Roncière says, what would it mean to make equality a presupposition rather than a goal, a practice rather than a reward situated in some distant future? In other words, this idea that actually we start to reenact and reproduce this inequality, or there's a danger that that might happen. And in The Ignorant Schoolmaster, Roncière talks about the work of Jacotot, a French teacher who had to teach Flemish students who spoke no French, the novel Télémaque by Fénelon. Jacotot's own ignorance of Flemish meant that his ability to do this was limited, but he discovered that the students taught themselves a complex text because of their will to learn. He says, the conventional hierarchical relationship of teacher and student was reconceived as an emancipatory mutual journey of discovery, where a pure relationship of will to will had been established between master and student. I always found that idea of will to will very interesting and inspiring, that the role of the teacher, according to Roncière, is not about teaching content, but about engaging the will that's already potentially there. He says, the intelligence of the book was also the thing in common, the egalitarian link between master and student. So both teacher and student are engaged in collectively trying to understand and make sense of the text. And there is a kind of mutuality there, which does not start from a premise of any lack in the student's part, but starts from a presumption that they already have capability and intelligence. So Roncière says that the engagement with the book sealed a new relation between two ignorant people who recognize each other from this point on as intelligent beings. And I guess I just wonder how that might be thought about educationally, that we start off with seeing students as intelligent beings who can already do a lot of things. And actually it's about how can we develop their will. And for Roncière, there's a particular value to art in this. So to come back to theatre and performance, it's not about the transmission of the artist's knowledge to the spectators. In other words, it's not about what does this play mean? What does this book mean? What does this painting represent? Trying to almost put the artwork in some sort of revered position. It's much more about using it as a fulcrum for debate. It's the third thing, he says, that is owned by no one, whose meaning is owned by no one, but which subsists between them. So they're grappling, student and teacher grappling through this together. So to come back to this quote, perhaps Roncière would challenge the binary here, or at least complexify it. Teaching from a perspective of universal intelligence around a third thing means that what you do right now does shape the future, but it also enacts right now because it enacts the sort of present that is needed and brings something into being. However, it's the aesthetic experience beyond and outside the day-to-day nature of everyday life which helps this become possible. The artwork is not everyday life, so it's not knowable. It's always beyond us. It's something which operates as a symbol, something to be engage with. Both teacher and student grapple around this third thing, trying to make sense of it. And I'll be interested to know if you think this idea could be translatable in other subjects, this idea of teacher and student working on a common goal, and it perhaps links back to the project idea of future studies. And I'd also be interested to hear your thoughts on whether the idea of starting with what might be or what is not possible rather than what currently is something that could be developed in project briefs and assignment briefs. Might briefs also bear in mind the need for some sense of what's practical alongside such speculative thinking, like Massini's model earlier, a blend of the possible and the practical? So just throw my couple of questions in as I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick, for your very inspiring and thought-provoking talk. Lots of, points that can be raised. There's, as I said, yeah, there's lots of inspiration, definitely. I don't know if there's any questions from our audience. Can just wave, raise questions. Maybe. Well, I can ask a question just to start, if that's okay, and then with time to the other to think about. Just one thing that came to my mind, Nick, is the fact that you didn't mention the word dystopia at all in your talk, and I was wondering whether actually dystopia was addressed to what extent in the seminars, also of course from in terms of purely from a research point of view, as I think that anyhow we cannot talk about the future without taking into account, or utopia, let's say, we cannot talk about utopia if we don't take into account dystopia as well. So in other words, is there any traces of dystopia that you thought that was useful to follow or to discuss, or did the students in their workshops focus on that as well?
I didn't talk about one of the things that Pedro actually did in the staff development conference last week, which is the POLAC game, which is this exercise where people are invited to place themselves on a view of how pessimistic or optimistic they are about the future, and then also whether they feel they have agency to change things or no agency, and place themselves on a continuum and then getting into discussion about that. So I think what was really interesting about that exercise, speaking as somebody who positioned myself quite negatively in that workshop to start with, saying I don't really feel very hopeful and I don't feel I can do much about it, that actually through the conversation people started to say, well, what can I do, and actually what can't I do as well? And I guess, I suppose I think that those things are there, and it's important to be aware of what's possible, but also to be constantly thinking about what we can do to change things without, absolutely being naive and sort of thinking everything can be great and can be perfect. But I guess there's a lot of environmental campaigners would say recently, that the future is looking very bleak, but we can only do what we can do to try to make some sort of difference. But I think the role of dystopias is really interesting, and I'm going to be editing an issue of Research in Drama Education. That's one of the things I explicitly put around the future. And that's one of the things I explicitly put in is around dystopias and how do they play a role. So I do think it's something to be thought about. And future studies does take into account dystopias. There's definitely talks about, our fears of the future. But I guess this idea of plurality starts to be hopeful, because it just stops you being restricted to only thinking about one thing, which kind of, I guess, limits agency.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions? Jane, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Nick. It's really kind of chimes with much, I think, that we've been doing collectively, but also that I've been thinking about I'm writing a piece currently around, I don't want to give too much detail because it will sound like I'm going off on a tangent, but it's developing a nesting methodology as a research methodology. And I guess it's playful and it's playfully serious, but it is not only metaphor, but it's metaphor. So it's like literally building a nest, but also writing. So it's a writing methodology of, you know, gifting each other twigs and reeds and ideas and concepts, and some don't go in, some get thrown out. And but we're kind of seeing it, and we're playing with this idea of hope as a concept and hope as a practice, and thinking about it in terms of the Anthropocene and what that might mean for childhood studies. And one of the things that I came across yesterday when I was reading was this idea by Tom van Doren, a Dutch kind of post-humanist scholar, about hope as a praxis. So rather than a psychological state or a feeling, it's something that we have to labor at. So it's a project that has a kind of ongoing, it doesn't have a beginning, we're always in the middle, and it's the kind of ongoing relentless labor that we need to kind of commit to. And that we share with others. And I just, when I heard you speaking about hope and, you know, the kind of the participants put into a place of discomfort or vulnerability through the workshops and playing, but, you know, kind of this futures, the idea of futures thinking, you know, is it a praxis? Does that chime with, you know, does that have any kind of resonance for what you've been doing in this project? I just think it's a kind of a potentially really fruitful way to think about it, rather than I need to think in a positive way and therefore it's hopeful. Actually, it's more than that, isn't it? It's a kind of form of activism, if you like. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I think it's great hearing that word praxis again. That's in my PhD title. Because I love that word so much. But yes, that idea of not just a practice, but a kind of philosophically informed practice, I find really, really inspiring. But the flip side is that you have to enact the philosophy, I guess, and that it has to be something that lives. And I think it's kind of really nice for me reminding myself of that element of what drama and theatre brings, which is embodiment. And I think one of the things, like Katie, I can see you there. But that's so nice about that, doing those status exercises, is seeing the embodiment of that in people, rather than just conceptualizing and relating to this object, thinking of that as a praxis, like it's actually you're enacting something that is a philosophy, you know, it is a kind of belief system that you're doing in the playful space of a workshop, but it's just so serious. It's like, what am I going to do with my life? What am I going to do with the future? What do I think about this? It'll be really interesting to then think about how that leads to action in the bigger sphere outside the classroom or the drama space. You know?
I think the other thing that, so from the reading that I've been doing, is that it's in the minor gesture, you know, so Erin Manning, who's a philosopher, writes about the minor gesture, but, you know, it's through the small things. So hope doesn't need to necessarily, as a praxis, be enormous activism. It can be very small activism in the moment, and kind of attuning to situations and feelings and sensations. And that's where I'm interested in, you know, this kind of embodied practice. When you sense something and you attune and you're attentive, then that has great capacity to kind of enact this hopefulness, which I think is to me anyway, that sounds as if what you know was kind of potentiated in some of your workshop activities.
Absolutely. I think we get into, I'm not sure this is theoretically informed, it's just a feeling, but it's very easy to move either into I'm being very solipsistic and personal, or I'm not changing the world enough, and so what's the point anyway? And social media and the internet kind of reinforces that sense of passivity, rather than thinking about what am I actually doing to the world around me that I can impact. And hence, actually interesting, that Polat game, when I was first placing myself, I said, well, I can't change the future. And then I thought, of course I change the future all the time. I just don't change the global future. But all of these micro moments add up to something. And I think what you can take responsibility for as well, and I think sometimes, in a way, do these global conversations stop people thinking about what's what I love about that Roncière idea of working with the student on just that act in itself kind of is some sort of revolution.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? I understand that people who actually are part of the project, I don't know if they like to maybe add some points, some comments, or just other insights.
Yeah.
Katie,
hello.
please.
Yes. Hi, everyone.
Yeah.
Not much to add, really. I think more of a reflection on what Nick and I just kind of ran in Poland, and something I've been thinking about. We also did some of these workshops earlier in the year. In March, we went to Heraklion in Crete and ran some of these workshops as well. And one thing I've been reflecting on since seeing the participants in Poland is the type of thinking that we actually have seen become unlocked just by introducing these ideas of futures literacy and futures thinking, and even this idea of futures as a plural rather than a singular, seeing what that kind of unlocks in the participants from hearing about that prior to the workshop. Because in Heraklion in March, we had participants that took part really knowing nothing about futures or what we were doing. And the exercise that Nick was talking about, where they used an object to visualize their future and improvise with that, they were kind of given instructions beforehand to bring this along, and we discussed what the objects meant. And earlier in the year, with those Greek students who brought their objects, everything was very practical. The objects nearly across the board represented their future career, the idea that they had of what they would be doing in the future, as opposed to the other day in Poland, they had to pick an object there and then in the room. Following hearing all these discussions, they heard Nick's talk about theatre, they heard Lois Damhoff's talk about hope as a radical act and things like that, and then hearing, and me and Nick spoke about this, hearing their sort of metaphorical descriptions of why they'd picked these objects, and all of a sudden their ideas of the future were so much more fluid and multiple and pluralized, and all of the objects that they picked, very few of them actually picked something to do with their future career or something practical and singular in that way. They were much more open to these ideas of what futures might possibly emerge, and I found that really fascinating to watch, just to see how quickly these ideas can actually be embedded within them just from hearing about futures before taking part in the workshop. I thought that was something really interesting, and also just this idea of actually that the aim being to empower them quite often in the exercise that we did about status, and gaining awareness of how they might hold themselves, carry themselves, embody certain feelings and modes of being in day to day, but it's actually about empowering them to be aware of that. So in the exercise, we were also getting them to look at other people and keep an eye over the next week on how other people sort of conduct themselves, what their status is to each other, what their status is in a room, what their status is to a particular object. And I think as soon as you're giving them awareness to kind of keep an eye out for that type of stuff, you are empowering them in certain ways, and that's something really that comes from theatre, and it's pretty magic to see it in action of people not so familiar with those concepts. So it's been really fascinating project to be involved with. Yeah. And well done, Nick, again for the talk. It's really interesting hearing it second time around. It's a really, really fascinating talk. So well done.
Thank you.
That's really
well done. Well done from me too, because it's the first time I hear Nick's talk, so that's why I joined. And also, unfortunately, I've missed Katie's workshop, so it's good for me to join the dots, because as Nick said, this is the final stage of the project, and now we're also trying to translate some of the toolkits into other kind of projects, maybe, or actions. And personally, I'm fascinated. I joined this project quite lately. I'm from CAPE, I'm from the Center of Academic Practice Enhancement, but my research also has to do a lot with embedding coaching techniques into pedagogies and education. So I was drawn into this project mainly by Pedro Tessena, who is the elephant in the room, because he's like one of the key driving forces, especially in relation to, because with coaching and mentoring, it all has to do with the future. You know, how do you see yourself in the future? And also the other aspect, which I think is fantastic for you, Nick, to present it in this context, is the interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. And this is something maybe we can discuss for future projects. So yeah, that's all from me. It was great to see your talk, Nick, and good to hear everything went well in Poland, and the workshops went well with Katie. So yes, that's all.
Great, thank you. Caterina, any other questions or comments?
I just wanted to pick up on what Katie said about the spontaneity of the students choosing the object there and then. I just think that's such an interesting insight, that when they planned something and sort of went away and thought about it in this very organized way, it sounds like it was less exciting and interesting than doing it in the moment there and then. And I just wonder pedagogically what that has to teach us about the value of spontaneity and kind of thinking instinctively. Something very interesting about that, and sort of chimes with what Jane was talking about, I think, as well, in terms of the playfulness of that, rather than this very sort of serious, planned approach.
Okay, great. Is there any other questions? If not, maybe I'd just like to ask you, Nick, whether there's any follow-up, something that maybe you like to, yeah.
Thanks for the prompt, Abel. So yes, we have a multiplier event on the 14th of July, which Katerina and Katie help me here. But the idea is that we're basically seeking to, and we've got hopefully some schools coming to experience some of the workshops, but we're also inviting career staff and potentially teaching staff to come along and learn about the project. And because all of the modules aren't quite downloadable in full yet, but they will be soon on the website. Great. So we're really keen to encourage. So if anyone wants to contact me, I'll make sure that we pass that on, and it'll be good to try and disseminate that through whatever channels we have in the education team to schools wide and far, and teachers wide and far as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Have I said that right? Is there anything else, Katerina, about that?
Well, sorry?
Yeah, yes.
Have I got that right, what it is?
As far as I understand, yes, 14th of July is the date.
That's great. So, yeah, I think that, maybe we can finish now. Yeah, so many thanks again, Nick. As I said, this was our final seminar for this year for the ecopedagogies and the difficult dialogues strands. We thank you very much for attending our seminar. It has been, we hope, a very enriching and inspiring experience. And we'll be working, towards another series of seminars for the next academic year. In the meantime, we wish you a nice and restful summer break, when it comes.